Labor Day weekend marks the unofficial end of summer for many Americans. Maybe you're planning a trip to a favorite lakeside town or inviting neighbors to a Labor Day barbecue. But why do we celebrate Labor Day? According to the Department of Labor's website, Labor Day is described as a creation of the labor movement and is a dedication to the social and economic achievements of American workers. This particular description is by no means exhaustive in explaining the full nature of this particular American compliance. Labor Day is far from over, and its history is dramatic, complicated, and downright bloody. In reality, Labor Day's inception was a political move by President Grover Cleveland to pacify angry unions in 1894. The rationale for Labor Day has been rewritten and labor's antiquities ignored. Morgan Reynolds writes that unions were known for being secret societies with secret oaths, and unionists engaged in intimidation, threats, vandalism, and violence, especially against uncooperative workers denounced as subhuman, scabs, and blacklegs. Private property, freedom of contract, competition, and freedom of movement across occupations were celebrated concepts. But the Department of Labor must have forgotten all that. Unfortunately, Labor Day was not an act of appeasement, and President Cleveland, genuinely wanting to acknowledge the labor movement's social and economic achievements, saying achievements should be easy to find, isn't quite on point, because such achievements were largely imaginary in 1894. The decades following the American Civil War was a time of great change in the United States. During the second half of the 19th century, working conditions in railroads, mines, mills, and factories were amongst the worst in American history. Poor ventilation, long hours, low wages, unsafe conditions, and child labor are just some of the concerns of the working class. A labor movement started due to the poor working conditions at the time. It was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and it's not uncommon for employees to regularly work more than 80 hours a week. The 5-day, 40-hour week most Americans are familiar with today didn't come into commonplace until the 1940s. Unions began to gain in popularity as American workers demanded better conditions, higher wages, and fewer hours. Strikes and protests, such as the 1886 Haymarket riots in Chicago, which resulted in the deaths of 7 police officers and 4 civilians, showed that something needed to be done. In the late 1800s, American workers began demanding 8-hour workdays. At this point in history, employees did not automatically benefit from safe working conditions, fair hiring, firing, or grievance procedures. Workers had no sick leave or annual leave. To deal with these unfair labor practices, workers united and formed unions. But even unions were marred by the corruption and racism that pervaded American unions because of the practice of excluding African Americans, Chinese, Mexicans, Catholics, and immigrants from parts of Europe. Native Protestants is a label that white northern men gave themselves to distinguish themselves from white immigrants and to signify that they were born and raised in the United States. As for African Americans, after the Civil War, many migrated north in search of low-skilled jobs in factories and manufacturing. The railroad industry provided many job opportunities for African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century. But Native Protestants saw the influx of African American workers as a threat and fear that they will rob jobs because they will be forced to work longer hours for lower wages. So many of these white men joined or formed associations that constitutionally prohibited not only African Americans, but Catholics and other minorities.
Smithers, where's that union representative? He's 20 minutes late.
I don't know, sir. He hasn't been seen since he promised to clean up the union.
Whoa! What the hell?
African American workers were forced to form their own unions, such as Pullman porters. Many incidents led to the establishment of this party. Throughout the 1880s, workers' strikes were repeated. In May 1886, growing problems between workers and management flared up. The labor movement had set May 1st as the date they wanted the industries they worked for to comply with their demands. Their rally cry was 8-hour day with no cut in pay. On May 3rd of that year in Chicago, a peaceful strike turned violent, with police opening fire on the crowd and killing 2 strikers. The next night in Chicago's Haymarket Square, the violence escalated exponentially into a riot that left several policemen dead and 4 other workers killed. 8 of the union protesters were arrested for killing police officers. 7 of the men were sentenced to death, 4 were hanged, and 1 committed suicide before being hanged. 6 years later, the governor of Illinois pardoned the remaining 3 men, calling them victims of hysteria, a crowded jury, and a biased judge. The national and international reaction to what became known as the Haymarket Massacre and the resulting trial led to May Day becoming International Labor Day in 1890, celebrated around the world.
We'll take on that greedy union, and we'll get back our dental plan.
After the Haymarket Massacre during the Depression, Chicago industrialist George Pullman cut more than 30% of his workforce by laying off hundreds of employees and cutting wages for many remaining workers. In addition, he refused to reduce rent or store rates in his company's town of Pullman, Illinois, where his workers worked and rented accommodations.
Well, let's look at the contract ourselves, eh? Benefits, perks, a green cookie on St. Patrick's Day. Oh, it didn't used to be this way, Smithers. No, it didn't used to be this way at all. Come on, crack those atoms. You, turn out those pockets. Atoms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 of them. Take him away.
You can't treat the working man this way. One day we'll form a union and get the fair and equitable treatment we deserve.
If only we had listened to that boy instead of walling him up in the abandoned coke oven.
Angry and financially distressed employees staged a strike in May 1894. The Union of American Railroads boycotted all trains using Pullman's wagons as a support. This Pullman strike was powerful because it essentially shut down rail traffic and commerce in 27 states from Chicago to the West Coast. Companies were forced to ask the federal government to end the strike so as not to lose too much money. That's when President Grover Cleveland responded by ordering federal troops into the city to enforce any order requiring railroad workers to return to work. When Union troops arrived, Pullman's strike spiraled out of control. Riots broke out after rioters destroyed hundreds of railroad cars south of Chicago. The National Guard responded to these threats by opening fire on the crowd and killing 30 people. Even before this railroad strike, the president and Congress knew that labor problems in the United States were spiraling out of control, and they sympathized with workers. They realized the problem was global and sought a solution far from the unfortunate events of the Haymarket Massacre a few years earlier. In June 1894, while the Pullman Company and railroad workers were still on strike, Congress passed legislation making the first Monday of September a federal holiday to recognize and honor the contributions of American workers. So, why do people work on Labor Day? Labor Day is a federal holiday, which means all government offices are closed, including the post office. Banks, which follow the Federal Reserve holiday schedule, are also closed, and many private businesses follow suit. However, the closure of private businesses isn't mandatory, and many large retailers and chain stores remain open, as are most restaurants, so some Americans still have to work on Labor Day. If you liked our video, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more videos like this one.